The HOA told me I was violating modern community standards. I was feeding chickens on land my family's owned since before microwaves were invented. Apparently, roosters crowing is now a national emergency if you live next to someone with a luxury SUV and no sense of irony. I didn't fight back right away. I let them dig their own grave with bylaws and buzzwords, while sitting in a building that, spoiler alert, might not be as theirs as they think. Do you like stories with petty power trips, real estate karma, and one rancher who quietly owns more than he lets on? Grab your coffee. This gets personal, legal, and just the right amount of poetic. It was 6 in the morning on a Tuesday when I first met Whitney Hale. I was out feeding my chickens, enjoying the peaceful start to another day on the ranch that's been in my family for 3 generations. The morning air was crisp, and the roosters were doing their thing when I heard the unmistakable click-clack of high heels on gravel. Now let me paint you a picture here. We're talking about a working ranch with dirt paths, hay scattered around, and the occasional mud puddle from the sprinkler system. So when I turned around and saw this woman strutting toward me in what looked like designer stilettos and a pristine white pantsuit, I knew this wasn't going to be a social call. Whitney Hale was everything you'd expect from someone who moved here from Orange County 6 months ago and immediately decided she knew better than everyone else. She had that particular brand of confidence that comes from never being told no, paired with the kind of outfit that screamed, "I spent more on this purse than most people spend on groceries in 3 months." Her blonde hair was pulled back in what I later learned was called a power bob, and she was carrying a leather portfolio that matched her shoes. The whole ensemble might have been impressive in a boardroom, but out here with my chickens pecking around her feet, she looked about as out of place as a fish riding a bicycle. "Are you Gray Walker?" she asked, her voice carrying that slightly nasal tone that suggests someone who's used to being the smartest person in the room. I nodded, setting down the feed bucket and wiping my hands on my jeans. "I'm Whitney Hale, president of the Meadowbrook Community Homeowners Association. I'm here on official business." She opened that fancy portfolio and pulled out what looked like a legal document, holding it toward me like it was some kind of magic spell. "This is an official HOA violation notice. Your property is in direct violation of several community standards and regulations." I took the paper from her perfectly manicured fingers and started reading. According to this document, my ranch was guilty of producing agricultural odors, creating noise pollution through normal farming activities, and engaging in incompatible land use that was somehow detrimental to the community's aesthetic standards. The letterhead read Meadowbrook Community HOA in elegant script, and at the bottom was Whitney's signature with the title President and Community Standards Director. I had to give her credit. She'd certainly made herself important in the 6 months since moving here. "Mrs. Hale," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured, "this ranch has been here since 1947. The HOA community was built around us, not the other way around." She shifted her weight, and I noticed one of her heels had sunk slightly into the soft earth near my chicken coop. "That may be true, Mr. Walker, but times change. We have a responsibility to maintain certain standards that protect property values and ensure a modern living experience for all residents." The way she said modern living experience made it sound like my chickens were some kind of medieval torture device. I watched as she tried to extract her heel from the dirt without losing her composure. And I'll admit, there was something almost comical about watching someone so determined to project authority while literally stuck in the mud. "The notice gives you 30 days to address these violations," she continued, finally freeing her shoe and leaving a perfect stiletto-shaped hole in the ground. "I trust you'll take this matter seriously." With that, she turned and walked back toward her pristine white BMW, each step a little more careful than the last. I stood there holding that violation notice, watching her drive away, and for the first time in years, I felt something stirring that I hadn't felt since my grandfather passed. The need to protect what was mine. After Whitney disappeared down the road, I walked back to the old barn where my grandfather used to keep his office. The wooden filing cabinet in the corner hadn't been opened in months, but I knew exactly what I was looking for. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, were the original property deeds and documents from when Grandpa Morrison bought this land back in 1962. As I untied that string and spread those papers out on the workbench, I couldn't help but smile. Whitney Hale had no idea what she'd just walked into. You know what they say about the quiet ones? We're usually the ones who've been preparing the longest. 3 days after receiving that violation notice, I got a call from Eleanor Whippy, one of the longtime residents who'd been living in the community since 1968. "Gray, dear," she said in that sweet voice that carried just a hint of mischief. "I thought you should know that Whitney's called an emergency HOA meeting for tonight. She's got herself a whole presentation planned about the ranch problem." Eleanor had been the court clerk back in the day when my grandfather was buying up land, and she'd always been kind to our family. "I have a feeling you might want to be there," she added before hanging up. That evening, I cleaned up and drove over to the Meadowbrook Community Center, a building that, according to my grandfather's records, sat on land that Morrison Trust had been leasing to the HOA since 2018. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked through doors that were technically on my family's property to attend a meeting about evicting me from my own ranch. The community room was packed with about 20 residents, most of whom I recognized from around the neighborhood. There was Rick Davenport, who ran an insurance office in town and had been secretly buying fresh eggs from me for the past 2 years, though he gave me a distinctly cold nod when I walked in. Whitney had transformed the front of the room into what looked like a corporate boardroom. She'd set up a laptop connected to a projector and was wearing what I can only describe as her power suit, a navy blue number that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Her husband Preston was there too, looking every inch the successful attorney in his $1,000 suit and gold watch. I'd heard around town that Preston had political ambitions and saw this affluent community as his launching pad to bigger things. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Whitney began, clicking her laser pointer with corporate precision. "Tonight, we're going to discuss a critical issue that affects every single property value in our community." The first slide appeared. Meadowbrook 2020 5 Luxury Living Vision. She'd clearly put serious work into this presentation, complete with charts and professionally designed graphics. As you can see from our market analysis, agricultural operations in residential communities typically decrease surrounding property values by 15 to 20%. Preston stood up to add his legal perspective, and the man knew how to work a room. "The Homeowners Association has both the right and the responsibility to enforce community standards," he said, his voice carrying that authoritative courtroom tone. "We have legal remedies available to address non-compliant land use, and we intend to use them if necessary." The way he emphasized legal remedies made it clear that this wasn't just a friendly neighborhood discussion, they were preparing for war. That's when Eleanor Whitby raised her hand from the back of the room. At 67 years old, Eleanor had seen this community grow from farmland to the upscale neighborhood it was today, and she wasn't easily intimidated by PowerPoint presentations or legal threats. "Whitney, dear," she said with a sweet smile that I had learned meant trouble was coming. "I'm curious, do you actually know who owns the land under our feet?" Whitney's laser pointer wavered slightly, and I saw Preston shoot his wife a quick look that suggested this wasn't a question they'd prepared for. Before Whitney could answer, 8-year-old Tommy Chen raised his hand from where he was sitting with his parents near the front. Tommy had been visiting my ranch regularly for the past year, fascinated by the chickens, and always eager to help with feeding time. "Mr. Gray teaches me about taking care of animals," he said, in that clear, honest voice that only kids seem to possess. "Why is that bad?" The room fell silent for a moment, and I watched Whitney struggle to find an answer that wouldn't make her sound like she was crushing a child's dreams. Tommy's simple question had hit home in a way that all of Whitney's charts and graphs couldn't touch. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. The contrast between my simple button-down shirt and jeans and Whitney's corporate presentation setup wasn't lost on anyone. "I appreciate everyone's concerns about our community," I said, keeping my voice calm and respectful. "I've lived here my whole life, and I understand how important it is that we all get along as neighbors." I paused, looking around the room at faces I'd known for years. "I'll certainly consider what's best for our community moving forward." It was a carefully neutral statement that could be interpreted as submission by those who wanted to hear it that way, but Eleanor Whitby caught the subtle emphasis on our community, and I saw her knowing smile. The meeting wrapped up with Whitney assigning a compliance committee to monitor my ranch activities and setting a follow-up meeting for the next month. As people filed out, Rick Davenport made a point of avoiding eye contact with me, while several other residents offered polite but distant goodbyes. The message was clear, the community was choosing sides, and mine was looking pretty lonely. I waited until everyone had left before walking up to Whitney, who was packing up her presentation materials with the satisfied air of someone who just won a significant victory. "Impressive presentation," I told her honestly. "You clearly put a lot of work into this." She looked up at me with surprise. I don't think she'd expected a compliment from her adversary. "Thank you," she said, her guard dropping slightly. "I just want what's best for everyone." For a moment, I saw past the power suits and corporate presentations to someone who genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. It almost made me feel bad about what was coming next. Almost. As I walked back to my truck, I pulled out my phone and dialed a familiar number. "Sam, it's time. I need you to pull every land record from 1960 to now. They want to play legal games? Let's see how they like the real rules." The next morning brought another surprise visitor. But this time it wasn't just Whitney clicking across my gravel driveway. She'd brought reinforcements, a whole team that looked like they were preparing to document a crime scene. There was Whitney in another designer outfit, Preston with an expensive briefcase, a photographer with professional equipment, and a guy with measuring tools who introduced himself as a land use specialist. They'd come prepared for battle, and they wanted me to know it. "Mr. Walker," Whitney announced with all the authority she could muster, "we're here to conduct a formal compliance inspection as outlined in the HOA regulations." She held up another official-looking document, this one even thicker than the first violation notice. "This is a formal compliance notice, and it requires you to remedy all violations within 30 days or face legal action." The way she said legal action made it sound like she was personally going to drag me to court, and from the satisfied look on Preston's face, that might not have been far from the truth. I stood on my front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching this circus unfold in my front yard. The photographer was snapping pictures of everything: my chicken coops, the barn, the fence posts, even the free-range eggs sign I'd put up by the road years ago. The land use specialist was measuring distances and making notes on his clipboard. Whitney was directing the whole operation like a general commanding troops, pointing out various violations and making sure they were all properly documented. "I need you to explain these unauthorized commercial activities taking place on residential land," Preston said, his voice carrying that prosecutorial tone that suggested he was already building a case. He gestured toward my egg sign and the small stand where neighbors occasionally picked up fresh produce. "Operating a business in a residential zone without proper permits is a serious violation of both HOA regulations and county ordinances." I sipped my coffee and watched him perform, for Whitney's benefit, wondering if he actually believed his own legal theater. That's when Eleanor Whitby appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, walking up my driveway with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had all the time in the world. At 67, Eleanor moved with the confidence of someone who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by much. She was carrying a plate covered with a checkered kitchen towel, and she nodded politely to Whitney's inspection team before climbing the steps to my porch. "Good morning, Gray," she said, settling into one of my porch chairs like she owned the place. "I brought you some of my famous cinnamon rolls. Thought you might need some comfort food after all this excitement." Whitney's inspection ground to a halt as Eleanor made herself comfortable, clearly planning to stay and observe the proceedings. "Mrs. Whitby," Whitney said with forced politeness, "we're conducting official HOA business here. Perhaps you could return at a more convenient time?" Eleanor smiled that sweet, dangerous smile of hers and shook her head. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of interrupting, dear. I'll just sit here quietly and watch. You know, this whole situation reminds me of when Gray's grandfather bought all this land back in the day. I was just 20 years old then, working as a clerk at the courthouse, and I remember thinking what a smart man old Morrison was." The measuring specialist froze in the middle of calculating distances. Preston's legal presentation stuttered to a halt, and Whitney's laser-focused direction suddenly seemed a lot less certain. "What exactly do you mean by all this land, Mrs. Whitby?" Preston asked, his attorney instincts clearly picking up on something important. Eleanor took a delicate bite of her cinnamon roll and chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Well, it was quite the investment back then. Farmland was cheap in the early 60s, and Morrison Trust bought up everything they could get their hands on. Smart man, that Morrison. Very smart man." I allowed the inspection to continue, making notes in a small notebook while Whitney's team documented everything they could find. What they didn't realize was that I was documenting them just as thoroughly as they were documenting me. Every question, every measurement, every legal threat went into my notebook, along with timestamps and observations about their methods. When Preston mentioned potential county violations, I made sure to note that down too. When Whitney talked about property values and community standards, I wrote down her exact words. The inspection team packed up their equipment with the satisfied air of people who'd accomplished something important. Whitney approached me as I stood watching from my porch, her confidence fully restored after 2 hours of documenting violations. "Mr. Walker, I hope you understand the seriousness of this situation," she said, her voice carrying that tone reserved for people who refuse to see reason. "The community has standards, and we intend to enforce them." I nodded thoughtfully, then looked past her to where Eleanor was still sitting in her porch chair, quietly finishing her cinnamon roll with that knowing smile playing around her lips. "I understand completely, Mrs. Hale," I said, closing my notebook and tucking it into my shirt pocket. "In fact, I think it's time everyone in our community learned a little more about local history." Eleanor's smile widened just a fraction, and I saw her give me the slightest nod of approval. As Whitney's team drove away in their convoy of expensive cars, I pulled out my phone again. "Sam, they just finished their documentation. I think it's time we started ours. Can you meet me at the ranch tomorrow morning? And bring everything. Deeds, surveys, lease agreements, the whole Morrison Trust file. It's time these people learned who they're really dealing with." Whitney Hale had clearly decided that subtlety was overrated. 2 weeks after her inspection team had finished documenting every chicken feather on my property, she called what she grandly termed a community press conference to address the ranch situation. She'd managed to get Cheryl Hawthorne, a local blogger who covered community news, to attend what was essentially a very small, very one-sided media event designed to paint me as the neighborhood villain. The venue was the community center again, my family's building being used to publicly attack my family's ranch. Whitney had outdone herself this time, setting up a proper podium with microphones and everything. She'd even arranged chairs in neat rows, like a real press conference, though the audience consisted of maybe a dozen residents and one blogger with a digital camera. Whitney herself was dressed in what I can only describe as her media personality outfit, a red blazer that screamed authority, paired with professional makeup that looked like she was planning to appear on the evening news. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today," Whitney began, her voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who'd been rehearsing the speech for days. "We're here to discuss a serious threat to our community's values and property investments." Behind her, Preston had set up a display board with enlarged photos from their inspection. Pictures of my chicken coops, my barn, even my vegetable garden somehow made the cut as evidence of agricultural violations. The Meadowbrook community has worked hard to establish itself as a premier residential destination. We cannot allow one property owner's commercial agricultural operations to undermine that investment. Cheryl Hawthorne was busily taking notes and snapping photos, clearly eating up the suburban drama. I'd heard around town that her blog, Meadowbrook Matters, had been struggling for content lately, so a good neighbor dispute was probably exactly what she needed for clicks. Whitney had prepared talking points about property values, community standards, and legal precedents, delivering them with the kind of passion usually reserved for matters of national importance. Preston chimed in with legal commentary, explaining how the HOA had exhausted all reasonable accommodation measures and was prepared to pursue all available remedies. The whole performance might have been impressive if it wasn't so clearly targeted at destroying my family's legacy. Whitney painted my ranch as some kind of commercial farming operation that was destroying the neighborhood's character, conveniently ignoring the fact that my commercial activities consisted of selling eggs to neighbors and sharing vegetables from my garden. She talked about noise complaints from my roosters that had been crowing on this land since before half the complainers were born. She mentioned odor issues from animals that were cleaner and better cared for than most people's pets. But what really got to me was when she started talking about protecting our children from inappropriate influences. She somehow managed to suggest that my ranch was teaching kids outdated values and exposing them to unsanitary conditions, a direct shot at 8-year-old Tommy Chen's visits to help feed the chickens. The way she described it, you'd think I was running some kind of dangerous cult instead of a small family farm that had been part of this community longer than most of the houses had existed. Preston's legal presentation was even more theatrical, complete with references to property law, zoning violations, and the HOA's fiduciary responsibility to protect homeowner investments. He threw around terms like class action potential and setting legal precedents, making it sound like my chicken coop was a threat to suburban living across America. The man had definitely missed his calling as a politician. He had that gift for making minor neighborhood disputes sound like constitutional crises. By the time Whitney wrapped up her presentation, I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot, having arrived just in time to hear her closing remarks about taking whatever legal action necessary to preserve our community standards. I watched the attendees file out, most of them avoiding eye contact with me, while a few offered those awkward nods that people give when they're not sure whose side they're supposed to be on. Rick Davenport practically sprinted to his car to avoid having to acknowledge me, despite the fact that he'd been buying my eggs the entire time he'd been publicly supporting Whitney's crusade. The breaking point came 3 days later, when Cheryl Hawthorne's blog post went live. The headline read, "Local Ranch Threatens Community Harmony," and the article painted me as some kind of stubborn holdout, refusing to join the modern world. She'd used all of Whitney's talking points and added her own editorial flourishes about progress versus tradition and one man's refusal to compromise. The comment section filled up with opinions from people who'd never set foot on my property, calling me everything from selfish to backwards to suggestions that I should just move somewhere more appropriate. I sat at my kitchen table reading that article, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Real, genuine anger. Not the mild irritation of dealing with difficult neighbors, but the deep, burning fury that comes when someone attacks your family and everything you stand for. I read it twice, then set the laptop aside and walked to my grandfather's old desk in the living room. Inside the bottom drawer, wrapped in the same oilcloth where I'd found the property deeds, was a letter my grandfather had written to me years before he passed away. Gray, it read in his careful handwriting, "If anyone ever tries to take this land from our family, remember that we own more than they think. Protect what matters and don't let anyone push you around just because they're loud." I folded that letter carefully and put it back in the drawer, then reached for my phone. "Sam, I need you here tomorrow morning. Bring everything we discussed and prepare for a fight. These people have no idea what they've just started." I'll admit, what I did next probably wasn't the most mature response, but sometimes you have to let people think they've won before you show them how wrong they are. 3 days after Cheryl Hawthorne's hit piece went live, I called Whitney directly and asked her to schedule another community meeting. "I'd like to address everyone's concerns," I told her, keeping my voice humble and slightly defeated. "I think it's time we found a solution that works for everybody." Whitney could barely contain her excitement when she called the meeting to order that Thursday evening. She'd clearly spent the past few days savoring her victory, and now she was ready to accept my surrender with all the grace of a conquering general. The community room was packed again, but this time the atmosphere was different. People weren't just curious. They were expecting a resolution, and most of them seemed to think that resolution would involve me packing up my chickens and moving somewhere more appropriate. I dressed differently for this meeting too. Instead of my usual work clothes, I wore clean khakis and a button-down shirt that actually had creases from being ironed. I looked like someone who was ready to capitulate, ready to join the modern suburban world that Whitney had been promoting. When I stood up to address the room, I even managed to look a little apologetic, like someone who'd finally realized he was fighting a losing battle. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice carrying just the right note of resignation. "I've done a lot of thinking over the past few weeks, and I've come to realize that maybe it's time for some changes." I could see Whitney practically glowing with satisfaction in the front row, and Preston was nodding approvingly like a teacher whose difficult student had finally learned his lesson. After careful consideration of everyone's concerns about property values and community standards, I've decided to sell the ranch. The room erupted in surprised murmurs and what sounded like relieved sighs. Whitney looked like she'd just won the lottery, and Preston was beaming with the satisfaction of a successful legal campaign. Even some of the residents who'd been friendly to me looked pleased that this long neighborhood dispute was finally coming to an end. Rick Davenport actually smiled for the first time in weeks, probably already calculating how much his property value was about to increase. That's when Sam Granger walked into the room. Sam had been the Morrison Trust's family attorney for 15 years, and he looked every inch the professional legal representative in his tailored suit and leather briefcase. He was also carrying something that immediately changed the energy in the room, a professional-grade projector and a laptop bag that suggested this meeting was about to become much more interesting than anyone had expected. "But before I make any final decisions about selling," I continued, watching Sam set up his equipment with practiced efficiency, "I thought everyone should know exactly what they'd be getting." The projector hummed to life, and Sam's first slide appeared on the wall behind me. It was a simple title slide that read, "Morrison Trust Property Holdings, Meadowbrook Community Overview." Whitney's confident smile faltered slightly as she realized this wasn't going to be the simple surrender she'd been expecting. Sam clicked to the next slide, and the room fell silent. It was a detailed map of the Meadowbrook community from 1962, showing property boundaries and ownership records. The entire area, every street, every lot, every building, was outlined in red and labeled Morrison Trust property. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sam said in his calm professional voice, "I'd like to walk you through some important information about land ownership in your community." Preston immediately stood up, his legal instincts kicking in as he sensed that this presentation was about to become a problem for his wife's campaign. "I'm going to need to see documentation supporting these claims," he said, his voice carrying that challenging tone attorneys use when they smell weakness in an opponent's case. "Historical property records can be complex, and I'd want to verify the legitimacy of any documents before we proceed with this discussion." Sam smiled, the patient smile of a lawyer who'd been preparing for exactly this challenge. "Of course, Mr. Hale. I have complete documentation going back to the original purchase in 1962, including county records, survey maps, and continuous chain of title documentation." He clicked to the next slide, which showed photocopies of the original deeds, all properly notarized and filed with the county. "The Morrison Trust has maintained clear legal ownership of 847 acres in this area, including the land underneath most of the homes in this community." Eleanor Whitby chose that moment to stand up from her usual seat in the back row. "That's absolutely correct," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been there when it all happened. "I was working as a clerk at the courthouse when Morrison Trust bought this land, 20 years old and fresh out of secretarial school. But I remember every detail of those transactions. It was the biggest land purchase in the county that year." The room was dead silent now, with 20-some residents trying to process what they were hearing. Whitney's face had gone pale, and she was staring at the projection screen like it was displaying information in a foreign language. Preston was frantically taking notes, probably trying to figure out legal challenges to what he was hearing, but Sam's documentation was clearly thorough and professional. "This meeting," I said, letting my voice carry just a hint of the satisfaction I was feeling, "is being held on Morrison Trust property, in a building that my family has been leasing to the HOA since 2018. I paused to let that sink in before delivering the line I'd been planning for weeks. But that's not the most interesting part of tonight's presentation. Sam clicked to the next slide, and I watched 20-some faces go through the same progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then the dawning realization of just how completely they'd misunderstood the situation. The new slide was a detailed property map of the current Meadowbrook community, with individual lots clearly marked and color-coded. 23 of the 30 homes were highlighted in red, with a legend at the bottom that read, "Morrison Trust Leased Property." "Ladies and gentlemen," Sam continued in his calm, professional voice, "the Morrison Trust currently owns the land beneath 76% of the homes in this community. These properties are leased to individual homeowners through Morrison Heritage Holdings, a property management company that handles the Trust's residential leasing operations." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a list of addresses, including, I noticed with particular satisfaction, the address where Whitney and Preston Hale lived. Preston shot to his feet so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. "This is impossible," he said, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of trying to maintain his legal authority while his world collapsed around him. "I reviewed all the property documents when we bought our house. There was no mention of lease arrangements or trust ownership." Sam smiled that patient lawyer smile again and clicked to another slide showing lease documentation. The original leases were structured as 99-year agreements, with automatic renewal clauses. Most homeowners assume they own the land beneath their houses, but legally, they're long-term tenants. Whitney hadn't said a word since the presentation began. She was staring at the screen with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away, but unable to process what she was seeing. When Sam clicked to a slide showing her own address, highlighted in red, with lease documentation clearly visible, she made a small sound that might have been a whimper. That's when Rick Davenport did something that surprised everyone in the room. He started laughing. Not the nervous laughter of someone uncomfortable with tension, but genuine, hearty laughter that echoed through the suddenly quiet community center. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Gray, I owe you an apology. Hell, I owe you about 2 years' worth of apologies. Here I've been sneaking around, buying eggs from you while publicly supporting Whitney's campaign to kick you out. And it turns out you're my landlord." Eleanor Whitby chose that moment to stand up again, and I could see she was enjoying this revelation almost as much as I was. "Gray, dear," she said with that sweet smile that had been making people nervous for decades, I think now might be a good time to mention that overdue rent issue we discussed. Sam nodded and clicked to his next slide, which showed a detailed accounting spreadsheet. The Morrison Trust has been absorbing the cost of community center maintenance and HOA administrative expenses for the past 5 years, he explained. The total amount of unpaid ground rent and facility usage fees comes to $47,300. The silence in the room was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Whitney looked like she might faint, Preston was frantically scribbling notes and probably calculating legal escape routes, and most of the other residents were staring at the projection screen like it held the secrets of the universe. Tommy Chen's parents, who'd been avoiding me for weeks, suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable about forbidding their son to visit my ranch. Now, I said, standing up and walking to the front of the room, I want to be clear about something. I'm not interested in evicting anyone or causing hardship for my neighbors. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could, but I am interested in being treated with the same respect I've always shown this community. The Morrison Trust has been subsidizing HOA operations for years without asking for recognition or special treatment. We've maintained the land, supported community activities, and tried to be good neighbors. Sam clicked to his final slide, which was titled, Moving Forward Together. The Trust is prepared to offer several options, he said. First, all current lease agreements can be renewed under their existing terms, with ground rent continuing to be absorbed by the Trust as a community service. Second, the Trust will establish a formal community improvement fund using a portion of rental income to enhance shared facilities and maintain common areas. Third, the Trust requests that all harassment of ranch operations cease immediately and that normal agricultural activities be recognized as grandfathered land use consistent with the property's historical character. Whitney finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You mean our house? We're renting from you? I nodded, trying to keep any trace of smugness out of my expression. Morrison Heritage Holdings has been your property management company since you moved in. All your rent payments, maintenance requests, everything has been going through the Trust. Preston was rapidly flipping through papers in his briefcase, probably looking for their lease agreement and wondering how he'd missed something so fundamental about their living situation. Eleanor stood up one more time, and I could tell she had something important to add to this conversation. There's one more thing everyone should know, she said, her voice carrying that tone of someone about to deliver the final piece of a puzzle. Gray's grandfather didn't just buy this land as an investment. He bought it to protect it. Morrison always said that if the area ever developed, he wanted to make sure it developed the right way, with respect for the land and the people who lived here. She looked directly at Whitney as she continued. The Morrison Trust has been subsidizing this community for years because that's what good neighbors do. Maybe it's time some people learned what that word actually means. The meeting ended with what you might generously call productive discussion, and what you might more accurately describe as 20-some people trying to figure out how their entire understanding of their living situation had been completely wrong. Whitney and Preston left without saying another word, though I noticed Preston was already on his phone, probably calling someone about legal options. Rick Davenport came up to shake my hand and formally apologize for his behavior, and several other residents who'd been cool toward me suddenly seemed very interested in repairing those relationships. As I packed up Sam's presentation materials, I couldn't help but feel satisfied with how the evening had gone. Whitney Hale had spent months trying to evict me from my own land, threatening legal action and trying to destroy my family's legacy. Now she knew that she'd been renting her house from me the entire time, living on land that my family had owned since before she was born. Sometimes the best revenge really is just letting people know the truth. The week following our revelation meeting was interesting. Word spreads fast in a community like Meadowbrook, and by the weekend everyone knew that the HOA president, who'd been trying to kick out the local rancher, was actually renting her house from him. Cheryl Hawthorne, the blogger who'd written that hit piece about me threatening community harmony, called to ask for an interview for what she was now calling a correction and clarification article. I politely declined, figuring the truth had spoken loudly enough on its own. Whitney Hale resigned as HOA president on Monday morning, submitting a brief letter that cited personal circumstances and conflicts of interest without going into the embarrassing details. Eleanor Whitby was unanimously elected as interim president, and her first official act was to formally recognize my ranch as a heritage agricultural preserve that contributed to the community's character rather than detracting from it. Preston Hale showed up at my ranch on Wednesday afternoon with what he called a proposal for moving forward. Gone was the aggressive attorney who'd been threatening lawsuits. In his place was a much more humble man who understood that his family's housing situation depended entirely on maintaining a good relationship with their landlord. "Gray," he said, standing on my front porch, "I want to apologize for how we handled this situation. Whitney and I made assumptions and acted without understanding the full picture. I'd like to offer my legal services to the Morrison Trust, pro bono work to help with property management issues, lease documentation, whatever you might need. Consider it community service." It was a smart move. Preston was a good attorney, even if he'd been on the wrong side of this dispute, and the Morrison Trust could use legal help with managing residential leases. I accepted his offer, with the understanding that his first project would be reviewing all the HOA regulations to make sure they aligned with the Trust's property rights and the community's actual legal structure. Whitney herself didn't speak to me for another week. When she finally did approach me, it was while I was working in my vegetable garden on a quiet Saturday morning. She looked different, less polished, more human somehow. She was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt instead of her usual designer outfits, and she wasn't carrying any legal documents or violation notices. "I found something," she said without preamble, holding out an old photo album. "My grandmother's pictures from when she was young." She opened the album to a page showing black and white photographs of a farm that looked remarkably similar to my ranch. "She grew up on a place like this, back in Iowa. I'd forgotten that until all this happened." Whitney looked around my garden, taking in the neat rows of vegetables and the chicken coop visible in the background. "I think maybe I forgot a lot of things when I moved here." We talked for about an hour that morning, and I learned more about Whitney Hale in that conversation than I had in all the months of HOA disputes. She'd grown up in suburbs and cities, always moving up to bigger houses and better neighborhoods, always focused on the next level of success and status. The ranch represented everything she thought she'd left behind. But seeing her grandmother's photos had awakened something she'd buried under years of corporate ambition and suburban expectations. "I started a garden," she told me as she prepared to leave. "Just a small one behind the house. Preston thinks I've lost my mind, but there's something about having dirt under your fingernails that feels real, I guess." She paused at the edge of my property. "For what it's worth, Gray, I'm sorry. Not just about the legal stuff, but about trying to change something that didn't need changing." Tommy Chen started visiting again the following week, his parents having realized that teaching their son about responsibility and caring for animals wasn't such a terrible thing. Word spread among neighborhood families, and soon I found myself giving impromptu educational tours to curious children who'd never seen chickens up close or understood where their food actually came from. Eleanor suggested that these informal visits could become a regular community program. The Morrison Trust established the Community Improvement Fund that Sam had mentioned, using rental income to upgrade the community center, improve common areas, and maintain walking trails. Instead of being the neighborhood nuisance dragging down property values, my ranch became a selling point, a unique amenity that attracted families who wanted their children to grow up with some connection to the natural world. Rick Davenport not only continued buying eggs from me, he started bringing friends and colleagues interested in supporting local agriculture. My small operation grew into something that actually qualified as the commercial agricultural activity that Whitney had been complaining about, but now it was welcomed as a community asset. The irony wasn't lost on me that Whitney's attempts to shut down my farming activities had actually helped them flourish. Eleanor remained as HOA president, bringing wisdom and institutional memory that the community had been missing. Under her leadership, HOA regulations were revised to recognize the ranch as a historical and educational asset, and new guidelines established to protect both property values and agricultural activities. The community found a balance that honored both progress and tradition. 6 months later, I was working in my garden when I noticed Whitney across the street, tending to what had grown into an impressive backyard vegetable garden of her own. She waved when she saw me looking, and I waved back. The gesture captured everything that had changed, from adversaries to neighbors who understood that community isn't about enforcing uniformity, but about finding ways to coexist while respecting each other's contributions. As I write this, it's been almost a year since Whitney Hale first clicked across my gravel driveway in those designer stilettos, carrying violation notices and threats of legal action. She still lives in the house she's renting from the Morrison Trust, but now she understands that home ownership isn't just about property values and modern conveniences. It's about being part of a community that includes chickens and vegetable gardens, neighbors who've been here for generations, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing your place in the world. Sometimes the best victories aren't about defeating your enemies, they're about helping them understand that they were fighting the wrong battle all along. Whitney learned that progress doesn't have to mean erasing the past, and I learned that sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones who end up teaching us the most about ourselves. The Morrison Trust continues to support the Meadowbrook community, the ranch continues to provide fresh eggs and life lessons to curious children, and every morning when I feed my chickens, I'm reminded that home isn't just a place, it's a responsibility to the land, the community, and the future we're all building together. If you enjoyed this story of how a power-hungry HOA president learned that you should never mess with the quiet neighbor who might just own more than you think, let me know in the comments below what you think. Did Whitney really learn her lesson, or is she just biding her time for a comeback? And remember, in any community dispute, it's always worth checking who actually owns the land you're standing on before you start making demands. Sometimes the person you're trying to evict is the same person who's been keeping a roof over your head all along.